Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Dr Phemister, or Andrew, if I can call you Andrew.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, welcome to the Meeting People podcast. Thanks for sparing the time. I thought we would start with a quote from a newspaper, which goes like this. It's a little snippet that runs as follows. Dead wealth asserts its power over living wealth, the banker over the producer, the bondholder over the taxpayer. Now, that isn't from something written in 2026, but actually from 1878 from the Irish World, which I picked up in your book, which I'm going to hold up to the camera. Here, Land and Liberalism, I'll try that again, Henry George, and the Irish Land War. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to, dive into all those things, land, liberalism, Henry George, and the Irish Land War as well over the course of this conversation.
That's good.
And what's interesting about that quote is it is so pertinent to where we are today. So we'll hopefully be able to tie that in to kind of modern times, what was going on back then. So just to start off, what interested you in this period of history?
Well, I suppose I came to it really, I was initially interested in the scale and the size of the Irish diaspora. So this was my initial interest. Just the volume of people that travelled across the world and particularly across the Atlantic, and what that did to social and economic structures in both places, the places that they left and the places they arrived. And the ideas they brought with them, right? So there's tensions there that go on between, new societies and the people that arrive in them. So that was my initial interest. And from there, I kind of grew into trying to work out sort of the Irish involvement in the labour movement, essentially, in the US, which seems so different to what was going on in Ireland. There's this interesting parallel, which is that Ireland seems like a really radical society, and certainly late 19th century British politicians are very stressed about what's going on in Ireland.
Yeah.
These are kind of radical socialists that Ireland is going to kind of rise up politically against Britain, but also it's going to be socially and economically radical as well. And yet, Ireland also comes across as an incredibly conservative society, socially conservative, dominated by Catholicism. The Irish Free State that emerges after the Irish Revolution is very socially conservative. So there seemed to be, to me, this kind of really odd tension there. Why do these people that travel across the Atlantic form the basis of the labour movement? All your radicals and anarchists and all the rest of it are Irish in the US, but why in Ireland is that not the case? And yet there is this perception that the Irish on both sides are kind of dangerously radical. So I was curious about that. That was my initial kind of interest in it. And then there seemed to me to be a kind of a missing link, I guess, between those things. I was studying a guy called James Connolly, who's a very famous Irish socialist, Irish Marxist, who ends up dying in the Easter Rising when Ireland is fighting for its independence. And the question with Connolly was always, well, he's this Marxist socialist. Why is he dying in a national revolution, as it were? Why does he give up his life to fight for Irish freedom? So there seemed to be something in the connections between what Irish nationality meant, certainly to someone like Connolly, and social and economic radicalism. Now, these obviously connect to bigger questions about anti-imperialism and where Ireland saw itself in the context of the British Empire. So there was questions for me about what's the history of Irish socialism and Irish radicalism, and how does that play out in a country that is, basically almost completely rural and agricultural. It doesn't seem to fit necessarily with what we see elsewhere in other industrialized countries. So that was a curiosity for me. And that's how I kind of discovered this really interesting period in the Land War where radicalism seems to be, the fears that are put forward by the British government is that essentially this is the beginning of the end, both of the empire and of, capitalism as we know it, right? How do we keep things stable when the Irish seem to have discovered that they don't have to pay rents, their social protest can resist the enforcement of British rule through policing. This is going on at the same time as the labour movement is taking off in the US, which also seems to have the ability to resist social control. So there is this moment of really intense radicalism, and the Irish are central to it. So I was really curious about that. And then Henry George is there. And there is this confluence between these two. And I was interested, from a historian's perspective, you're always interested when, someone hasn't been written about particularly, so Henry George is a kind of, as you'll know, a kind of semi-understudied figure, like there are books about him, but the last kind of major, large kind of biography is like 1955, like the big tome there.
His star has waned.
And I was curious about that. And his star, obviously, that's the case both within Irish historiography, but also more broadly as well. My background, I did my master's in the history of political ideas, and someone like Henry George is basically not there.
Yeah.
He's ignored, So, you get all your big liberal thinkers in the US and Britain in the 19th century, and Henry George is just a populist rabble-rouser, right? He's more seen as a political figure than an intellectual figure.
Yeah.
And that interested me because his ideas are so significant, and so many people are paying attention to those ideas. And of course, this happens at a critical moment. So you have, George coming up with these ideas and popularizing them, and then you have in Ireland what seems to be the manifestation of those ideas, right?
Right. So let's take a step back. That's super interesting. We'll go deeper into all those things. You mentioned lots of words there: radicalism, socialism, Marxism, nationalism, conservatism. And then your master's was in political ideas.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting snippet in your book, which I'd like to kind of dive into, which is, do ideas have a causative historical role?
Oh, okay.
So, I interviewed Nigel McGilchrist, who's an ancient historian. His big thing was, trade leads history by the nose. Mm-hmm. And then with Robert Toombs, we touched on the great man theory and where it does apply, where most of the time it doesn't, but there are instances where men or women are very consequential and, largely man in history, I'd have to say. But where do ideas sit in that? How causative are they to, what actually ends up happening in the real world?
I think they're incredibly causative in that they structure how people behave. It's not necessarily the case that I don't think ideas are not the necessarily the engine driving. I think it's fair to say that, perfectly reasonable to take a materialist perspective and, understand these larger economic forces as being kind of the engine and the driver.
So like technology and population growth or whatever.
Population growth, yeah, absolutely. What ideas do. And I think the important distinction and the problem that the study of ideas has often had is that it's very, very easy to study ideas at the realm of, political theorists who wrote long tracts, big complicated works, who often engaged with other thinkers very deeply. And so you were able to trace these kind of, Smith was talking about Rousseau and Rousseau was talking, so you connect these thinkers like this because they seem to communicate with each other. And that is the realm of ideas. Right, and it's very easy then to keep that kind of separate largely, and you can connect it to events, and you can say, well, this political thinker was writing in the context of the English Civil War, and so he was interested in these kind of politics. But making that connection to the step down of like mass politics essentially and social movements, these kind of the forces that drive society, that's much harder. That's what I'm interested in doing.
Yeah, that threshold between ideas
yes.
and the real world.
Yeah, how do those ideas play out? Now, there's some interesting kind of theoretical approaches to these kind of things. Thinking about how practices themselves kind of assume a certain sociological interpretation of the world. So the way that we interact with other people and the small p political activity that we do, the things that we do that are engaged with how we live together, basically, as societies, have an implicit sociological assumption about how society should be structured, even in very, very small behaviours. That then, I believe, can be read as a form of political thinking. It's not articulate in that sense, it's not written down, but I believe that with a little bit of attention you can kind of tease out, well, how do these behaviours, what implications do they have for political ideas, and what might be the relationship between them? Now, to go back to your causative question, that's the tricky one. But certainly language does limit and constrain, people's realms of actions, because they can only really do what they can conceive of themselves as doing and understand themselves as doing. But this is why George is an interesting figure, because he doesn't so much engage with other political theorists. He engages with a kind of wider body of what he would often describe as sort of common sense thinking.
Yeah.
And it's what I find really interesting. He's so popular and he's so widely read that I think it's possible to see him as a kind of like a mouthpiece, really, for certain types of modes of behavior. So that's why I found him interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that people like this should basically have more attention to them paid,
And do you think they don't because ideas are basically, if looking in the 21st century, are relegated to the subs bench? Nothing comes from nothing. When Liz Truss or Rachel Reeves or whatever says, we need to have this tax or that policy, whatever, they're coming from somewhere. There's not, but they often themselves have no idea what they're saying, where it comes from, what the origin is. And again, reading someone like Ian McGilchrist, for example, who says, philosophy and history was once upon a time every, Seneca, Nero had Seneca, Alexander the Great had Aristotle. Every major ruler would have a philosopher with them. And now it's sort of like, we kind of have very little interest. And do you see your work as kind of trying to rekindle that?
It's a really interesting point that you make. I mean, if you were going to define the period in which we see that decline, I suppose, of the kind of intellectual statesman, we would see that from the Henry George period. We would see that from the 1880s.
People like Gladstone are these big towering figures.
They're the last figures, really, that exist in that kind of sphere, necessarily, or that have that kind of influence. I'm not saying that obviously there's very well-read MPs and people who engage in history and politics, but at the same time, but at the same time, you're right. It doesn't structure politics, and discourse doesn't take place within that language. It's assumed that, well, people have no interest in this, But I believe this is also related to the kind of the rise of mass politics and technocracy that George is very opposed to. I mean, George is, he's saying things like, we may not be philosophers, but we're all men and we should all be able to rationalize and reason. This is the basis for his idea of democracy, is that we can all communicate and we can all reason and rationalize with one another. But there's a lot of other stuff going on at this period, thinking about politics as a kind of mass organic society that needs controlled by people who understand, PR and understand, the operation of propaganda to shape people's opinions. Yeah. This is a totally different way of conceptualizing political engagement, essentially. Yeah. And instead of it being about rational people communicating and shifting their ideas, the John Stuart Mill's type of, liberty through democracy kind of thing, instead it becomes, well, yes, people are involved, but people at the top make decisions and they shape, which way people are going to kind of engage with those. So and then there's less need to have a public discourse about philosophy and history, is there? Because the people don't need to know that necessarily. And
they're guilty of being hyper-technical, trying to sound too clever, hyper-specialised, and they kind of become more and more insular. They go higher and higher in the ivory tower.
And of course, and early socialists, early Fabians would say, this is simply a consequence of the increasing complexity of society. Yeah. The industrial society is too hard. We can't have politics like some sort of ancient Athenian ideal where we all sit around and discuss things, because everything's too complicated. People don't understand, So it has to be left to the experts.
And it feels like the battle lines are kind of been drawn, and you're stuck in these categories. And which is Henry George's biggest strengths and his biggest weakness, was that he was neither a radical socialist nor anti-capitalism or anti-free markets per se. So he kind of crossed so many boundaries.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's kind of, as much as you can, categorize these things. Can you, with the assumption that these things overlap, talk about the history of, you've used the word liberalism, but the word radicalism comes up a lot. Okay. What is radical thought? Where does it begin? And you can go back as far as Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas if you need to, just to kind of, which is what you did in your book very helpfully. So, but what is this movement? That is, and why does it exist? Why did it come about?
Well, I think you're right to point out that none of this is really separable, And of course, when we're talking about these lineages of ideas, it's very difficult to describe them without paying close attention to the context in which they were kind of formed and formulated differently through time. The radical ideas during the English Civil War are different from the radical ideas in the mid-19th century. But in as much as we can kind of identify a theme of radicalism, it is essentially political egalitarianism, political equality. Often that interlinks with liberalism. There are forms of the two that you could say sit together that would see political engagement as necessary for freedom. That individual freedom relies on everyone being able to contribute to the politics, right? I would say that's a defining feature of, you could call it radical republicanism. And I use the word republicanism because republicanism, or res publica, the popular people's engagement with politics, and I modify it with radical because classical republicanism sees that as essentially the preserve of an elite.
A senate.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the reason for that connection with the elite is that they own property, and property then becomes central, because if you own property, you have a kind of a stake, essentially, in the society. And also you're not beholden to commercial interests, which can corrupt you, right? You have your own separate private wealth. This is the classical idea. You have slaves probably, and so you can contribute independently and rationally to the government of the society because you're not corrupted by commerce. Now, we would say, I suppose, and one definition of liberalism is a way of separating those things and saying we can have political equality with economic inequality. You see what I mean? So you can separate those things and have people's civil and political equality, while some people own lots of property and some people have nothing. The radical Republicans would say, well, we need to switch that around. Instead of separating the two, actually, we say everyone should have some sort of economic stake that justifies their political participation. Yeah. So that, I would say, is the kind of through line of radical Republican thought. It connects Henry George to, the levelers in the English Revolution. It connects him to other radical thinkers that have seen this kind of connection between an egalitarian spread of property as a basis for political participation, for some sort of democratic structure of society.
And where does religion fit into this? If you listen to Tom Holland, I don't know if you kind of got his whole theory of, the ultimate radical movement was Christianity, because in that ancient times, virtue and morality lay in strength, as you've alluded to. You own slaves, you've got property, you're kind of stronger. Mm-hmm. And then came this idea from some Jewish person, and who said, actually, we're all, the first should be last, and the last should be first, and the meek shall inherit the earth, and we're all got a stake in the world, irrelevant of how strong, how much we own. And so the ultimate kind of initial radical movement was monotheism or Christianity. Yeah. And if you look at people like Henry George, who are deeply Christian, that kind of deeply informs their... Does that overcomplicate things in terms of this categorization journey we're trying to do, or is it a really important part of it?
It's an important part of it. I mean, it complicates things, but doesn't overcomplicate. I mean, history's complicated. Yeah. These things exist in tandem. Absolutely, yeah. Christianity as the slave religion, as a deeply egalitarian thing. I mean, one of the curious things is that liberalism essentially, as a form that fights against the need to have some sort of economic equality, is resistant to both republicanism and the most kind of egalitarian forms of Christianity, and it sees both kind of Catholics and Republicans as essentially hypocrites. That they rail against luxury and overt signs of wealth, and yet they accept that this exists in society. That we have to put up with it. In terms of, radicalism is deeply infused, as you said, with kind of Christian socialism. I think it will be fair to categorize George in some senses as a Christian socialist. What's interesting in the 19th century is that there's this, Marx obviously is the key figure here, as the kind of rejection of these kind of traditional moral structures that seem to lie behind a lot of the demands for a more egalitarian politics that drive George as well. But we can see that as linked to a kind of a more technocratic approach anyway. That moralism itself is distasteful or meaningless in that sense, you know.
Yeah.
You know, the big kind of moment here, obviously, is the Enlightenment, where we see a kind of the Enlightenment is a complicated thing. You know, we can discuss whether there is even a thing as the Enlightenment, but if you were going to structure it as one single thing, you would say it's the turning of theology into history. It's not forgetting about God, but relegating God and raising up man as the key operating force in historical development. And that does some important stuff when it comes to, you know, how we justify things. We can no longer turn to, you know, God says, or these are natural rights, or whatever it is, become harder to justify, and we need to find other structures in which to defend them. And that essentially kind of takes a lot of the power and force, obviously, out of Christian socialism through the course of the 19th century. It does also mean, though, that, like, I think popularly and kind of on the ground, as it were, like that kind of moralistic language, while it's looked down on, and this is one thing that George struggles with, is that, you know, elite economists and political theorists read his work and they say, well, you know, it's full of all these kind of moralistic claims that he's always referring to God, and this doesn't make any sense in modern society. We can't structure our politics on these kind of religious claims. But this is what gives it his power and his appeal, you know, is that he's speaking a language that really resonates with people. So it's, absolutely, it's central.
So we've definitely lost a sense of sort of justice.
Yes.
That forms part of, let's say, tax policy or economic policy, which was central in that 19th century period. And as you say, the Enlightenment came along, you had a much more scientific or you know, utilitarian approach. You know, does it work? What does the data say versus what's right, what's fair, what's equal?
Well, there's just to pick up on that, there's a really interesting kind of sort of linguistic slippages that I try and identify in the book, which is when people are criticizing George, they keep wanting to go back to the language of justice. They say, well, this isn't fair, or it's not right. And several times, several writers, either in verbatim speech or even written down, will start off an argument and say, well, it's not just to tax people in this way or to do this. And then they'll stop themselves and they say, well, there's no point talking about justice because these aren't concepts we can use politically. And then they turn and they say, well, it's inexpedient, it's ineffective. And they realize essentially that by accepting George's kind of terrain of reference, the idea of justice and fairness, then they can't actually kind of defeat him on that ground. They have to move to a different kind of linguistic realm and talk about expediency
and rationalism,
which is more flexible for them.
It's flexible, but it's also kind of intermediary processor, right? It can't come from nothing. It has to be grounded on some value system, or some belief system that is, you know, that it sits on top of, and it's sort of middle to middle rather than end to end, and then it can spit out things that you can then use your intuition and. Which is then grounded on what you believe and experience that you know. So you said something interesting, that kind of socialism is obviously a really broad term, which for someone like me, all it means to me is kind of property confiscation. I just think of communism and kind of unfair taxes, kind of like, you know, of anti-business, anti-commerce, anti-kind of capital, you know, people making money, keeping what they earn, that kind of thing. Whereas what's been helpful about your book is it's broadened out that term for me, so it's not just about Marx. No. It's not just about Lenin, obviously. And Henry George was pretty free market, pretty pro-free trade, was very happy for people to keep the fruits of their labour, just didn't like the kind of unfair, unearned increment.
Yes.
So would you therefore still classify him as a socialist? Is that a socialist? Would the socialist be happy with someone being filthy rich because they've got a great business that, you know, uses land and doesn't use land but uses labour and capital effectively and takes risk and all that kind of thing?
Well, the first thing to say is, I suppose, that in that broader sense, socialism, I would say, is an integral part of liberalism.
Okay.
It's as a historical kind of genealogical concept has been there from the beginning. I mean, you mentioned Christianity and this kind of egalitarianism. It is an integral part of the kind of liberalism's moral perspective, I think, inclines that way. Now, separate from, Marxism and a more kind of technocratic, state-orientated communism, I think that's the key cut-off point, as it were, that our contemporary perspective on what socialism is
Right.
essentially constructed by, well, a lot of it's constructed by the Cold War, of course. It's constructed by the experience of the 20th century and what the USSR was. But it's also by Marx's particular perception about the role of the proletariat taking over the state and this kind of domination, the end of politics, as it were, and the growth of kind of technocratic control. But socialism as a broader concept in the kind of pre-Marxian sense is essentially is like radical liberalism, I would say, right?
It's just trying to...
Yeah. And I mean, the problem we have, of course, as well, is that people are using these terms in all sorts of different ways. And George's followers can say things like, I'm an individualist and a socialist at the same time. And, they're using it malleably, but it's evidence really that the concept itself is malleable. And I think that's what's interesting about George as well, is that he comes at a time, or he's around at a time where socialism as a concept is being redefined over the 1880s. So George is... It's very easy to see George as a type of socialist in, say, the first half of the 1880s. He's on platforms with radicals. He's discussing and agreeing with people who would later become kind of, moving in a different direction necessarily to him, and become what you would conceive of as socialists in the present day. But over time, George distances himself from this kind of tendency, and the way I conceive of that is not so much that George changes, but that socialism itself shifts, yes, and becomes more focused on the state and less focused on the idea of the individual. It's that tension that I find so interesting, right? The idea that actually, for true socialism, as it were, has to focus on individual freedom and individual flourishing. Now, all that's present in Marx. Like, if you read the Communist Manifesto, it's, there's interest in honest development and human flourishing and, a type of freedom that is genuine and real. But, yeah, for George, that remains his kind of touchstone, essentially. That he's interested in people being able to develop their capacities, their human capacities, to their fullest extent. As far as I read George, that becomes his central orientating force, And the question of property then is the difficult question, right? Because is it a mechanism through which people develop their own capacities and interests and abilities and engagement with the world? Or is it a means of restricting other people's ability to do the same thing? Right?
Right.
And this is where...
So let's dive into that. So you get another quote. Land has been a critically unstable element in political thought.
Yes.
And you mentioned the word property rather than land, again, which is another issue with this whole area.
Absolutely.
When you say property, do you mean land? On the whole?
On the whole, in the period we're talking about, we're seeing a shift between those things. And that's what I'm interested in, right? That when, say, in the late 18th century, people were talking about property, they were talking exclusively about land, virtually. Lots of people in the late 19th century were still talking about property in those terms, meaning real property, land, not movable. But we see the shift at this point. This is when we see this transition. This is what's so interesting about Republican thought and its kind of cynicism or criticism of commercialism, as a corrupting force. That land, again, has that role of rooting people in a place and giving them an independent income, not just a connection with the natural world, but a stake in the wider society, in a way that money is slippery, right? That it allows people to move. It can move itself. It goes back to a lot of the kind of Christian hostility towards the idea of usury, making money from money, the idea that money itself is or should not be a productive force. Yes, yeah. It shouldn't be. Money is infertile, right? This is Aristotle's point: is that it shouldn't grow of its own accord. The only fertile force is land itself, and so there is something, well, as George would also put it in these terms, unnatural, essentially, about making money from money in that sense. And it's this shift from these different versions of property that I think is another correlate at this particular moment in the 1880s that changes things. There's a decline in this kind of suspicion or criticism of the idea that commerce itself is a corrupting force.
Yes.
George is an interesting intersection there, because lots of times in his writing, especially the more poetic elements, you do get the sense that there's sort of a deeply critical and cynical and depressed and disappointed perception of the nature of urban industrial society and commercial society, about people losing their control over their lives around them. That sounds sort of very similar to an early Marx, essentially. But it is just at that moment where we see that shift, that transition from. I will say one other thing about this, which is that in the historiography there is a kind of in the history of political thought, when we think about the history of republicanism and its connection to property, there is this moment in the late 18th century, particularly to do with Jefferson and the American Revolution, where the question is, and this has been a central feature of American politics, the history of American politics, is liberalism a central feature of the American Republic, or is a Republican criticism of property central to what's going on? And I'm trying to push.
So can you just unpack that?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So those are really interesting. Can you just expand on those two dichotomies?
Okay.
Just to clarify that for people.
So remember when we mentioned before about liberalism being this kind of distinction between accepting economic inequality and having political equality? There had been in the 1950s and 1960s this assumption that Locke and liberalism and this idea that we can have political inequality and economic inequality and political equality together was kind of the founding intellectual energy and drive behind the United States, right, in its early days. The kind of attempt to revive Jeffersonian political thought, and Jefferson was very critical about like commerce and the corrupting effect of commerce, and the necessity for a large republic to be essentially agricultural, because the people who couldn't be corrupted were people who grew their own food and lived on their own farms and had their own property, right? That these are the basis for the nation itself. That has been kind of a central feature of the history of political ideas in the last kind of 40 or 50 years, is to say, actually, this was an underappreciated element in the early American Republic. This might seem arcane, but of course, what's actually going on in the mid-20th century is arguments over the Cold War. I mean, what's going on in the historiography is, what is America? Is America a capitalist nation, or does it contain all these other complexities that are not quite as kind of Reaganite? Okay, so the historians who are recovering this older tradition are also making a political intervention. They're saying America is not, this just a capitalist nation with negative rights where people just make money and the government's only role is to help them make money, and that's it. Just stand back. So it's trying to create this. It's trying to recreate and confirm this existence of this other, quite radical tradition that is a bit more critical of commerce, essentially.
Right.
My contention is, and I think Henry George shows this, is that this is still alive a century later.
Yeah.
And this is still going on in the US a century later. This is, the foundation of the labor movement is not Marxist. No one's reading Marx in the 1880s, certainly not in the US, really. Not many people. There is, a small socialist party and whatever. But the force, the intellectual force is, they're quoting Jefferson. They're looking back to the early republic, and they're saying land should be held in usufruct. It should be held for the benefit of the living rather than the dead. The quote that you mentioned before.
And this is because if you don't have access to land,
yes,
you can't do anything. Effectively, you cease to exist. Is the phrase. If you give a man land, he can produce capital and do labour, as what Henry George says. But if you take land away, they cease to exist. And we are in that ultimate situation today where access, location rents, or the kind of unearned increment in places like where we're sat now in the centre of London, has pushed more and more, or is pushing more and more people into kind of subsistence, sub-subsistence level living.
Yeah.
And so the debate is still is as topical today as it was.
We had the debate over, the rising minimum wage and all this kind of stuff, and people saying, well, it's getting eaten up by rent. That you put these things up, and this will be George's point as well, that all that excess just then goes into the pockets of the people who actually own the property where people need to live or work.
But this is where I find Henry George so appealing, because it's such a broad church. And I can give you an example. So like they're debating in the California legislature right now a wealth tax, which has caused a lot of people to flee, a lot of very wealthy people, either billionaires but also kind of sentiment, people to flee the state and move to lower tax jurisdictions in America, or Florida, Texas, whatever it is. And the people criticizing this move say effectively that this is the end of private property rights, which I'd love to come on to. This concept of natural rights, harmony, natural kind of rights to land versus this is my property and it's sovereign, and no one should be allowed to come in and take that from me. Are the kind of two opposing forces. But what critics of this wealth tax are saying is, once a year someone's going to come into my house effectively and go, well, your TV's worth this, your jewelry collection's worth that, and your cars are worth this, and your shares and whatever things you own, companies you own, are worth this, and we're going to take 5% of all of that. I think I personally am probably not for that, like that ability to kind of have to kind of reaccount your wealth every year and then give a portion of it away. However, if the Californian government had gone, we're going to assess the value, whether you've got a farm on there or a mansion or a hotel, the unearned, the value of that land underneath it, see how that land, how much it would go for in the open market, and we're going to take 5% of that value because you haven't done anything to make that land worth anything. Everything on top of it, you may have, hopefully not through rent seeking, but you may have created a lot of fruit that has benefited lots of people. I'd be all for that, but it feels like this is the internal tension in the kind of radical community, which is like, is commerce per se bad, or is the unearned increment part of commerce the bad part? And that's the bit we need to strip out, but let people do what they want and interact and transact and form contracts as they wish to. Is that something that you've kind of contemplated, or is that kind of...
I find it very interesting because I've spent a lot of time thinking about the application of kind of Georgist ideas, and reading George is interesting because he's obviously accused by people at the time of being kind of single tracked, right? That and this is the criticism of many who were Georgists and then become socialists, is that yes, okay, it's a good starting point, and Marx's first point in the Communist Manifesto of what communists are going to do is they're going to turn land into public property, which is essentially what the land tax is intended to do, is to take the social value of the land itself back into public ownership. But George is not quite as dogmatic as that, and there are points in which he says, look, if this doesn't work, if the land tax does not create a kind of more equal balance in terms of what people own, then I'd be open to other possibilities as well, right? I think we have to bear in mind George's wider social ambitions as well. It's not just the case of wanting to, have this particular form of taxation and that's it, right? He's wanting he's recognizing, as many other radicals did, that extremes of wealth, an extreme inequality of wealth, is a corrupting force politically. You know, that people having so much more money than others is damaging for an equal share in having a say in our political life. What's interesting is that he was criticized by this, you know, this idea that actually it's a politics of envy, because the argument that some people would have against George at the time was that, well, the poor are doing okay, right? They're better than they were 30 years ago. It doesn't matter how rich the rich are. We don't need to think about that. We don't need to worry about the robber barons or whatever, you know, the Gilded Age wealth, the Carnegies and whatnot.
Yeah.
We need to concentrate on the fact that the poorest are doing better than they were 30 years ago. And that's the important thing. George would say, no, that's not the important thing. That actually it's a corrupting force for politics to have people with so much money and people with comparatively so little. So there is we have to bear that in mind when we think about, I mean, we're seeing at the moment, you know, kind of quite an astonishing, you know, pretty much never before seen in the history of the world level of disparities of wealth, where we have individuals worth more than several countries in the world. You know, the levels of billions is kind of astonishing. And I think that obviously George's solution to this would be, as you say, you know, a tax on land.
Yeah.
Whether conditions now would mean that proposal would create the solutions that he wanted, I can't judge that necessarily, you know. So yeah, I think it's a very complicated, and you know, there's been some interesting by people who were Georgists and who moved off in different directions into the early 20th century, other attempts to restructure economic relations in a way that would be fair to both this kind of individual idea of freedom and being able to own what's yours, but also not result in these huge accumulations of wealth. Things like decaying money, that's one of my favorite ones, the idea of money that, you know, if you hold on to it, it reduces in value. It actually sort of...
Okay, so you've got to spend it.
You've got to spend it. You've got to keep it in circulation. You can't be worth 4 billion because you need to actually spend that on things and do stuff with it, you know. One of the interesting things, and I think maybe we could get onto this in terms of the environmental aspects of George's idea.
Well, yeah, let's go into that. Yeah, let's go into natural rights, I think.
Okay, all right.
Because that ties into that a little bit.
Yeah.
And that versus private property, let's say, if that is the right dichotomy. But what are natural rights, natural law? Where does that feed into there? What are the origins of it? And are they still relevant today?
Okay, so the history of natural rights is multifaceted. There is a particularly a Catholic tradition that could trace natural rights as kind of connected to natural law being essentially a divine law, you know, that there is a purpose, an end to every living being on earth, that what is good is essentially them fulfilling their purpose and role on earth, right?
Potential,
exactly. And that feeds into very strongly a lot of radical thinking. There is also a kind of a slightly narrower history of natural rights that's connected to particularly the Protestant tradition, that sees them as essentially more limited, absolute conceptions of kind of ownership and possession, right? That there are rights to, you know, it's the Lockean thing, right? I own my body, therefore I own what's around me, okay? And or what I make, what my body kind of creates. These are interconnected, I would say, in lots of complicated ways throughout the past. They are not easily kind of separated. There's also the linguistic complexity, which is that people will use the word natural right, especially in you know, kind of more popularly focused political discourses, just to emphasize something as they seeing as kind of
common sense. It's sort of shallowed out.
Common sense, or immutable, or, you know, something that shouldn't be questioned because it's so obvious. It's natural. You know, but essentially it's a way of structuring political thought that makes reference to an external or higher power, right? I mean, this is the effect of it. But I think in a lot of the radical thought, what it does is it also connects and this is the natural law point, it connects rights and duties together, right? That there are, having a purpose is not necessarily a case of just a possessive role. That every right itself forms part of a larger structure in which it has a role to play in society. And land itself then has a role, doesn't it? Because the idea is that land is there for the sustenance and survival of humans. And if it's not performing that role in some way, if people are going without and suffering because they don't have access to this resource, then it is not performing its
Have you seen
role.
Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Not for a while. You'll have to remind me.
I think it's one of the obviously a great film for all the cheesy action and great one-liners, but it's actually a very Georgist film.
Right. Okay. I'll have to rewatch it.
Bear with me. But
okay, I want to hear this.
The thesis is that humanity is founded a colony on Mars, and there's a big kind of society, kind of city in Mars. That, and it lives in a bubble. And what's ended up happening is that a company or a group of individuals has taken control of the air supply.
Right.
And you have to pay a tax to get access to the air.
Yeah.
And every year the kind of tax goes up and people are getting poorer and poorer. And there's a big kind of what the owners of this business company or these people find is that the original colonists on Mars, spoiler alert, but go and watch the film anyway because it's brilliant, but had created a system which would reoxygenate the whole planet.
Right.
So you wouldn't need that initial air bubble that would filter the air and then give you the ability to breathe. Mm-hmm. And those people therefore hid that secret,
right,
so that they could extract the air rents from the colonists. And Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of goes in, and he's a kind of that classic I can't remember the word, but like a flawed hero who ends up emancipating the colonists. And it was like, I kind of like, oh my God, reading Henry George, like, oh God, of course. These people, there was the ability to breathe air, and the ability to stand on land and have access to land without that access being made so expensive through the owners of that land extracting rent from you, either through selling it to you or from renting it from you, literally, is the same thing. Air versus and it's the earth. It's that kind of that harmonious nature that we need access to. And if you see, the countryside in the UK, for example, landowners are making it harder and harder for people to, do their walks, go to get access to kind of nice parts of the countryside, because they put put cows in the fields, they close off the gates, the turnstiles, and we're losing that access to the thing that we need to be able to survive and thrive, and it's I don't know. I'm not going.
There's so many interesting things there. One is that the point you make about access to land is distinct from the economic element of it, right? So, one of the things that happens in the late 19th century is that a lot of kind of progressive liberal reformers are very interested in the idea of getting people to access land, right? This is the time when the Commons Preservation Society emerges and the National Trust emerges, right? These are ways of, it's all connected to concerns about kind of physical degeneration, that the idea that people are living in cities now and they're getting shorter and the food isn't as good, and we need to get the working class out into the countryside to get them strong again. It's a very significant part of it, but what it does do is it takes away the economic aspect. There are I mean, obviously the allotment movement is one key thing in Britain that does try and say actually access to land should be productive, and it should have it should allow people to engage with it economically and not necessarily in the allotment movement sort of make a living from it, but support them, right? There should be some kind of supportive element. But it is interesting that in terms of access to land, it shifts to being something that, as George would see it, or the earlier radicals might see it, as something that's necessary for political participation and necessary for economic survival, into something where it's like, well, you go and have a nice walk in the countryside.
So that's where I was going with that. So there's this, people who believe in natural rights have this perspective that human beings are kind of fundamentally good, or they have this potential that they need to be able to fulfill, And if you restrict their ability to do that, then they're not going to be able to fulfill that, and therefore, vice, crime, immoral behaviour creeps in.
Yes.
Whereas the other side of the kind of more utilitarian, or the kind the property side of the argument is that actually no, people are fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
And you need some sort of government, big government or big state to therefore kind of manage that. Which is, I always think of big state and socialism as one thing, which I've learned now not to from reading your work, which is a helpful thing in itself. But there's that kind of natural harmony believers. You get rent seekers out the way,
yes,
and then people can flourish.
Yeah.
Versus actually and then the liberals are kind of in the middle, where they kind of acknowledged
torn on both sides.
Yes, land's a problem. But what we need to do to solve the problem is a bigger government and more utilitarian type policies.
Yes.
Is that the right way to frame it?
I think that's a very interesting way of framing it. And one thing I would add to that, and I think that's implicit in what you're saying, is that there's another way of looking at these distinctions, which is one is a politics of the city and one is a politics of the countryside. That there is something kind of and this goes right back. You mentioned the idea of like an overarching power to control. This goes back right to someone like Hobbes, writing in the mid 17th century, sorry. Who's saying that proper freedom can only happen within a city, essentially, within a place that is controlled and has power at the top, centralized, so that people are protected. Because the natural world is not some sort of beautiful state. It is the war of all against all, right? Without protection, it's the state of nature.
And he was writing for the king, effectively.
I mean, yes.
And was saying, like, we need a monarchy because we need some central power that's divinely ordained to protect and control.
Yes. And it wasn't about having a say in that politics. It was about protecting the rights of the individual, essentially, not to be kind of destroyed by the horrendous conflicts that can emerge when there isn't that essential top power, as it were, and that people are embodied within the kind of. Anyway, we won't go into Hobbes.
Yeah.
The point I was just trying to make is essentially that we can see these things as, and this goes right back to when we talked at the beginning about what's the connection between ideas and the existence of life and social practices. Well, and there is maybe this connection then between the type of social practices and the type of existence that takes place in an urban environment, right? And the type of social practices that take place in more rural contexts, right? Something about the direct engagement with the soil, that gives the idea that fertility and productive engagement with nature is itself meritorious and valuable and has a moral kind of element to it, I suppose. Versus within the city, the idea that everything's so complex and there's so many different desires and needs and so many things that need weighed up that it has to be done technocratically and there has to be a bigger authority.
There's that phrase, the hare is always ready jugged. Have you heard of that phrase?
I've not heard that, no.
I got it from Ian McGilchrist's work, but it's that to eat a hare, you need to jug it first.
Right.
Which is a kind of old phrase, skin it and take its guts out and all that kind of stuff. But when you are living in cities, the hare is always, you've lost that. You just get the bits that's already jugged for you, so that you never actually understand where it's come from. What the how it you've lost that connection.
Yes.
So it just becomes this thing.
Yeah.
That you've disassociated from, rather than actually being part of it.
Absolutely.
And then you understand its value to that.
And the other thing of that is that it's not just a case of, people in the city think this and people in the countryside this. There's also this kind of romantic desire or sense of loss or alienation that connects those things. I mean, there's, really the history of industrialization is also the history of longing for a rural life or, an escape from. I mean, George talks about this as well. He has poetry which says, I wish I could escape from the rat race and this, essential, all this horrors of trying to kind of fight for survival that city life brings upon us, and I want to just do the kind of Rousseauian thing and escape to the woods and live in a cabin in the woods like Walden or something. It has that kind of romantic element to it, which I don't want to downplay because I think it has a political kind of valence to it, I guess, right? It says something about how we perceive life. And you're right, George is ultimately very positive about the inner workings of human nature when given free rein. which
the,
shape
the individual interest aligns with the common interest. Is that thing?
It's finding the alignment. Yeah.
If you can get the individual interest to free themselves,
Yes.
then there is no tragedy of the commons type. Actually,
Yes.
they will find frameworks to work with nature to kind of keep it sustainable. And
Yes, which brings us on to the environmental question, which is not so. It's an interesting one with George because he is interested in increasing productive capacities and forces, and yet, as I've been trying to say, a lot of the motivations behind what he's doing is connected to a very visceral, and I've talked about it in the book as corporeal republicanism, which is a concept I'm trying to kind of flesh out myself. But essentially,
no pun intended.
Yes, that's right. It's essentially looking at the human body and the needs and capacities and capabilities of the human body, both in terms of the flourishing that we talked about and the mental capacities, but also the physical needs as both a kind of George calls it a title deed to the natural world, right? The fact that we need to eat, the fact that man can only eat so much, that essentially we all need to eat basically the same amount, that there's not some sort of wide capacity in human abilities and necessities, demonstrates that we should have access to the natural world, and that our access to the natural world should be largely commensurate with our human variation, right? So
Right.
You're a man earning 6 billion a year or whatever, is not earning that, and your man not earning anything is also requires sustenance, requires access to productive capacity in order to kind of fulfill the needs of the body itself. So he's very focused on that. And the other aspect to that is the concept of self-preservation, and this is where the individualist element comes in, right? That the ultimate law behind all of this is that we all have a right to preserve our own life, right? This is an animal thing. It goes back to the kind of natural law concept, right? That we need to be able to preserve our own life. Now, obviously, that's filtered through into socialism through the right to have access to food, the right to have access to natural resources to look after yourself. But it also connects, I think, and could be connected to the right to look after the world. That if our survival as a species is under threat and imperiled, that a very individualistic sense of I need to preserve myself can also be the basis for a wider kind of collaboration to protect the world. And that's one of the things that obviously George is writing in a different context, in a different place, and one of the common criticisms leveled at him was that he was very much a Californian in spirit, in as much as his vision of the world was shaped by this expanse of land that seemed to be less peopled, for instance, than back in Europe, right?
Or New York, or
New York, and that limits, I think, his ability to interpret, what society might look like when it's pushing up against certain limits in terms of its productive capacities and damage that might be done to the world. But I think intrinsic and inherent in his thought processes and this discussion about the connection between human survival and the natural world, the importance of it, kind of what you were saying about the air and the land and the sun question, that there is this kind of sense of which that there is an individualistic justification for protecting the natural world, essentially, for everyone's benefit. So it's
do you agree with him that with economic progress or progress comes a different type of poverty that is based on
because George was interested in, and this goes back to the human flourishing question, the question of alienation, right? So it's not just a case of being poor, it's a case of being kind of removed from the capacities of making yourself less poor, right? And he says that's essentially what comes along with civilization and modernity. And he says, the tramp comes with the locomotive, right? That we adopt that kind of poverty because we remove people from the capacity to earn their own living and to look after themselves in that sense. And you also destroy those kind of communal structures that exist in most kind of poor or peasant societies, in which there is sort of duty and obligation to care for those who are, unable to look after themselves or for whatever situation find themselves in difficult circumstances. That's then obviously for a lot of kind of progressive liberal thinkers, those ideas are then shifted onto the state. The state then rightly should take on those responsibilities, having destroyed them all, having burned down the monasteries and done all this kind of ripping up of the fabric of communal life. The state then has to take responsibility for replacing it. George has a different perspective and believes that essentially it can be built up again from the ground up. Yes, exactly. And of course that has this other aspect to it, which is that the very process of doing it is itself politically valuable, but also mentally and developmentally valuable. So, I mean, one of the connections there between someone like Mill, who is an interesting kind of shift figure in this same transition that we see with George.
So let's do a 101 on John
Okay.
Stuart Mill, because I think people will have heard of his name perhaps. He's often quoted in libertarian circles about
He is, liberty and freedom.
liberty, freedom, but like the nanny state, or kind of like the right to drink, smoke, whatever culture. Who was John Stuart Mill? When was he around? What's his relevance? His consequentialism?
So Mill is around early to mid 19th century. Dies in 1873. He is consequential insofar as he is essentially the major political and economic thinker that England offers up in the mid 19th century. He becomes a sort of mouthpiece for liberalism, mid 19th century liberalism. Famously, he starts off as a utilitarian. We can conceive of him as a utilitarian. His father was James Mill, who was an associate of Bentham, so that he comes from this kind of utilitarian background.
So, and very quickly on what is utilitarianism?
It's the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? That what is moral, what is right, what's a good decision is effectively a calculation, what you call the Benthamite calculus. That you would work out what's going to have the greatest positive effect, and you would do that.
You follow the data.
You follow the data. You don't necessarily... I mean, we see this today in the kind of effective altruism movement and this kind of stuff, that we need to stop thinking about intent, and we need to stop thinking about
values,
moral values. We just look at... Right.
So what works is what we do, which has flaws on many levels. So, but John Stuart Mill, starts out
there. But what's interesting about Mill is that, so he comes into that mental world. He initially is following his father in these kind of footsteps, but he realizes that utilitarianism has some central hollow element to it, right? There is something big missing here. So Mill tries to work out, well, it's not just a case of calculation. There has to be some other aspect to structure our kind of moral framework and moral
ground
values.
it.
Or ground it, yes.
Yeah.
And that's essentially the story of his kind of mental development and career, is working out what that might be and what that would look like. And he gets to a point, when he, at the end of his career, where he would call himself a socialist, right? And land is the key feature here, because Mill's biggest concern towards the end of his life is essentially a Georgist one, about what to do about the centralization and accumulation of land, and the fact that land can't be owned or shouldn't be owned by in the same way as other forms of property. He talks about, what does he say? When you know what purpose a thing is, then you know what purpose it should be put to. And he says, well, land is needed. It's the Georgite argument. Land is needed for people's survival. Therefore, it cannot be monopolized and accumulated by a small number of people who keep it from others. So Mill, essentially kind of very strongly moves away from, these kind of utilitarian arguments, but also has a hostility towards a very narrow-minded kind of laissez-faire approach to, capitalism being, just untouched by the state, as it were. He says land is a different category altogether and needs to be managed as a kind of social resource, essentially.
And the biggest sleight of hand, if that's the right, without going too tinfoil hat, is that land no one talks about it anymore. It's become a subset of capital.
Yes.
And is viewed as kind of an essential part of the balance sheet, as per your equipment or your factory or whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we now have this what you describe as historical amnesia when it comes to Henry George.
I think so, because he's an awkward figure in that respect. Yeah. But the historical amnesia almost descends from George, from the reaction to George, because the reaction to George is that we need to discard these older forms of distinction that we used to have, the Ricardian distinction between rent and different types of profit, right?
Yeah.
That actually that's old
Interest
hat now.
and wages, yeah.
Yeah, it's old hat now. We just need to look at it in terms of marginal utility, right? We lump them all together and look at the difference between them, right? That's essentially what goes on. It's a kind of response to the problems that George poses to political economists.
Marginal utility, I'm quite interested in that, actually. Not that per se, but how that links to property rights. So can you actually let's do this. Can you expand? We've talked about utilitarianism very briefly.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about Malthus as well, and this other side of the coin to natural law, natural rights, where we talked a bit about Hobbes, where you've got this state of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Humankind needs pacifying, and nature is kind of wild and savage, and therefore you need effectively property rights to kind of constrain people from seizing each other's property, which I've grown up believing kind of property rights are an axiomatic good, but and for good reason. You don't want someone coming in just seizing whatever it is you own for no good reason. Can you either stillman or kind of give the other side of the equation its due in terms of what their grounding is, what their beliefs are?
In terms of the Malthus element.
Are they unrelated elements completely?
In terms of wider access to land, I mean, what's interesting, I think, about Malthus is that he offers a route out for those people who see the arguments quite firmly that land was made by God for the survival of the species, and therefore, and this goes right back to Aquinas, therefore there's no kind of natural right to own property and land because it's for everybody. You can occupy a portion of it and have the right to farm it and get the food from it, but the land itself is owned by everybody. And that basis is obviously, we talked about the religious dimension, has this kind of divine purpose of land, and Malthus comes along and essentially says no, that's not the case, that no one has a right to sustenance or survival, that God's divine plan essentially is that when there are too many people, some of them die. That's it, and that's okay. We just have to put up with that. And it's actually a case of the poor having too many children because they can't control themselves, right? And that's where we should put our energy in.
We overpopulate, we overuse resources.
So this is the Malthusian argument is essentially the negative one, that it's not a case of land needing to be better distributed. It's a case of we've got too many people. And that forms then the kind of the alternate anti-Georgist perspective right the way through the 19th century, right? So when George is making his arguments, you will, in the 1880s, because Malthus is writing in the very early part of the 19th century, you will still be getting people making Malthusian arguments against George. That actually, George, it's nothing to do with this. It's that there's too many people, too many poor people, and there should be fewer of them. And then rents would go down. And then, we wouldn't need to redistribute land or come up with these taxation systems. It's just that there's too many people.
Yeah. And he talks about that at length in Progress and Poverty.
He does, and he says, every mouth comes with two hands. It's not a case of there not being... it's a case of land not being distributed properly because everyone is able to earn their own living, right? Yeah. There is not too many people. That's George's argument. How that fits into, there's a whole, the population history today, and this idea of the Malthusian bomb that kind of gains credence in the early 1970s, and becomes a major feature of the environmental movement that you still see today. People concerned about overpopulation and the environmental impacts that's going to have. I think George's work kind of stands against that, essentially. Yeah.
And when we were talking about Mill, obviously you've used the word freedom a few times, which again it's become quite a right-wing term. If you look right, freedom is this sort of it's not a end goal in itself, is it? Or is it?
Well, it is for Mill.
It is for Mill.
It is for Mill. Mill sees it as the kind of the essential prerequisite for human flourishing, right? That you cannot tell people what a good life to live is. they have to learn that for themselves, because the process of learning it for themselves, one, it's individualized, that what's right for you might not be right for me, but two, the process of doing it is a process of gaining freedom and independence.
But it's just so fascinating, because therefore you would imagine again, this is coming to that association of socialism with big government, big regulations, lots of intervention. People need to be protected from themselves, so we need to have all sorts of rules to stop them from falling for scams, or stop them for,
But there's fewer things larger, more rule-bound, and more bureaucratic than corporations, I mean, and in this sense, large-scale capitalism and the state are twins. They're not antithesis to each other. Certainly in this Republican Millite tradition, right? They both take similar forms. It's interesting to me that Mill in On Liberty, in his sort of famous kind of right-wing, he talks quite sorry, not right-wing, but as you were intimating there, this has kind of been taken on as a kind of
small government
force, But what he puts quite a lot of emphasis on is the participation in local government. He spends time talking about, well, the reason why Americans are going to be free, he says, for a long time is because they are very good at self-organization. He says, if you go, this is obviously he's writing in 1859, if you go to the US, you will find that while the federal government is very small, on a local scale, everyone's involved in local committees and boards and management of their parishes and areas. And he says this is the sinews of democracy,
sort of participation,
because this is where people learn how to put their self-interest to one side and cooperate with other people. So we've got to think about politics, and I think this is really valuable for understanding how a Republican like George would have conceived of it as well. We have to think of politics as this direct participation process, but also one that forms character. That was very important for Mill. It develops your own individual sense, and it allows you to put your kind of desires, your ego to one side, and to understand how harmony might develop through communication, through cooperation. It's all about that learning and development that takes place. That's very significant.
Because parochial has become a charged word.
Yeah.
When actually it literally just meant, your parochial parish council was just the getting involved with local matters that weren't necessarily.
Yeah. It's interesting now. I mean, when we think about devolving local powers, it does still have a kind of, I would say, a kind of, it's not particularly well respected, kind of the idea of that, the important decisions take place up high, right? And that's where people want to get involved. Whereas actually, really, we want situations and contexts where people are more engaged with the politics around them on a local scale. But again, it goes back to the city and the country divide that you could talk about, because cities are transient places. People are in and out. They're anonymous. Whereas rural societies tend to kind of foster, or semi-rural societies foster that kind of closer engagement, because you have to kind of do it because there isn't this structure above you controlling things.
And does Switzerland get that right in some ways?
Well, this is Switzerland's often referred to. I mean, I can't speak for modern day Switzerland, which I don't know very well, but obviously Switzerland plays a big role for Rousseau. I mean, it's mentioned frequently by Mill. It's mentioned frequently by all these the radical tradition that we've been talking about, because it's this model of local participatory democracy. And it also has this other element, which is the armed citizenry element as well. This idea that there shouldn't be a standing army, that standing armies are corrupt, just like large corporations are corrupt, because if you're paying people to fight,
they're going to want to fight.
They're going to want to fight, and they're going to look for wars, but also they're going to do as they're told. There's no independent. This is the character formation, that the only way to protect and to prevent your republic turning into an imperial power that wants to invade and control is to have an armed citizenry that's only interested. Because if you haven't got a wide-standing army, but you are armed, then you're interested in protecting your society. You're not interested in invading other people. And this is the element that goes along with the elevation of Switzerland, essentially, as the ideal republic, that where people are armed. There's no standing army. They're not invading anybody. They have local democracy. This is
politics is quite boring, and everyone's
Politics is
involved
boring.
about bin collection and all
Yes,
these things that are actually
which is the
sort of
stuff that
matters.
affects people. Yeah, they don't want to be involved in larger wars or I think it's really important to bear that in mind, because the land question seems quite narrow, but it hits on all these wider questions about participatory democracy and what a republic actually looks like on the ground in practice. And just to take it back to Ireland, this is what's
literally I was going to come onto that, so please.
So, just to give some context about the land war, this is essentially a conflict about access to land, but also the level of rents. So there were small farmers. Ireland had a situation where there were lots of large Anglo-Irish Protestant landowners that owned huge swathes of land, but often were absent for large parts of the year because they were probably at their English properties. These were managed kind of by factors, other factors isn't the right word, factors what they call them in Scotland, but essentially kind of management, local management on the ground. And there's resistance there's a famine that takes place in 1879, and a growing resistance to the idea that all this money in times of economic scarcity should be going to landlords, and a demand that actually rent should be reduced. What happens in the land war is that there is a kind of an organization that develops, and largely from the ground up, although there is eventually a kind of top-down approach, called the Land League. The Land League is almost like proto-democratic in that sense, in that it's parish-based, it's very localized. There are branches throughout the country, and what they do is essentially say, well, we're going to take over the running of the state. It becomes a substitute state in and of itself. It has democratic structures at a local level, but it also does all the things that you might expect a government to do, in that people are kicked off the land. It collects money from its members, and it provides funding for them. It provides economic support, it provides legal support, and it's a sort of a lobbying institution as well to try and put pressure on the British government. And it also coordinates other forms of resistance, things like boycotting or kind of stuff. So we get in Ireland this idea that if you take back that power at a local level, there is very little that state authorities can do to limit you, beyond kind of actual physical coercion, sending in the army to force people, And even then, there was a lot of kind of passive resistance that goes along with that. So the Irish respond often by, refusing to drive the police officers. Everyone will refuse to feed them. There'll be no engagement at all. And all of a sudden, the British government realizes, well, without those kind of local structures, in place, having shifted over to the Land League itself, we are powerless. They can't prosecute because they take people to court, and everybody refuses to serve on a jury and refuses to convict.
So it's this very kind of passive, is it like Gandhi type?
Yes,
yeah.
And actually, it has this kind of longer tail, because that impacts subsequent anti-colonial movements, right? And it impacts even the structures of Irish resistance into the 20th century. And Sinn Féin and the Provisional IRA are talking about abstentionism and the type of distancing themselves that was going on in the in the 19th century in Ireland. So it has a long tail and a global tail as well. But what's interesting is the connection between the focus on land as a place, a security, a safety, escape from the state, and as a means of building up a kind of from the bottom up participatory democracy, as against, as they would have seen it, an imperial power.
Right.
That's what's so significant about Ireland. That's what connects sort of Georgist ideas with a very critical moment, right? So that, as you'll have read in the book, it's quite striking how internationally radicals in the US see the land war in Ireland as a third revolution, right? It's going to we had the American Revolution that gave us political rights. We had the French Revolution that gave us economic rights. The Irish Revolution, the land war, is going to finally emancipate us from the control of landlords. They talk about it being a final battle between aristocracy and democracy. And so it takes on, very briefly, this kind of global perception, and it's connected to it anti-imperial ideas, essentially.
And it's that big diaspora that's driving it as
The
well.
big diaspora is a huge role.
And Henry
in it.
George is very involved in this, and he writes about it in Progress and Property, doesn't he? He kind of has that very vivid image. I mean, during the famine, of food carts, being sent to England.
Yes.
Whilst there were mass graves, sort of as they were rolling past these mass graves of starving people, because the landlords were extracting rents from the land,
and this
at the expense of the people tilling it. And
this goes right to the heart of why Ireland seems to stand so centrally. I mean, it's not even just in the 1880s that radicals in the US and Britain see Ireland as kind of like the critical place for this kind of tension. You mentioned the famine there. That's a really important kind of aspect to it, because we get the British government during the famine saying, well, we can't interfere really with the market. Right? It's not. It becomes a kind of a test case for extreme laissez-faire, essentially. That the argument is put forward by both administrations, the Conservatives and the Liberals, who are both in power during periods of the famine, that too much interference with the market will actually make it harder to get food. Right? In Ireland, the idea is that, well, there's scarcity in Ireland, therefore food will flow there. And of course, that doesn't actually happen because people don't have the ability to buy.
They don't have the money.
Exactly.
Because they're extracting, getting rent extracted from them.
So there is this sense in which, that kind of entirely laissez-faire, free market approach is entirely undermined by what goes on in the famine. Now, obviously, that's an extreme case in Ireland, but it does have this resonance afterwards where it's like, well, these kind of things don't function in those kind of contexts, right? So it does have this longer tail, and it also, as you intimated before, places Ireland at the forefront of this kind of radical moment, because those arguments that George makes about food leaving Ireland during the famine, Irish radicals and nationalists are making these arguments straight away after the famine. They're saying, this is a kind of an extractive force that Britain is kind of Britain and capitalism therefore become coterminous, essentially. Marx called London the metropolis of capital, and essentially the British Empire is seen as the capitalist empire. Those two things are kind of connected quite closely together.
So wind, for the people who don't know how the movie ends, what is the after? Obviously, what happens in the immediate aftermath of the land war, and then what is viewed as someone like Simon Heffer. I don't know if you've ever read his stuff. Pretty right wing guy, wouldn't be viewed as a socialist in any way. Said that one of the biggest mistakes of British foreign policy was not listening to Gladstone and allowing home rule for Ireland. And if I've got that right,
they should have allowed it earlier.
They should have allowed it.
Okay.
And by not allowing that, obviously there was arguments of like it. Then what next? Are we going to lose Australia next? That kind of thing. But how does it? What's the aftermath of the land war? Who wins? And what is?
Well, the home rule question is interesting because that's obviously deeply connected. Yeah. So what happens is Gladstone puts forward a home rule bill in 1886. That falls in the Commons, and it leads to the kind of collapse and split of the Liberal Party, which is significant. He tries again. 1892, 1893, introduces another one, gets defeated in the Lords. And so by the time, I don't know Simon Heffer's argument here, but essentially by the time that Home Rule does get on the statute book, we are approaching the First World War, and Ireland essentially then has a revolution. Home Rule is old hat by that point. They're wanting independence entirely. And in which case, that does sort of signal the beginning of the end of the British Empire in that sense. It's an anti-imperialist conflict and interpreted as such by many of its participants. So I'm in terms of the counterfactual hypotheticals of what would have happened with Home Rule if it had been granted in 1886 is very hard to say. But in terms of the land question, so Gladstone's solution is a typical liberal fudge in many respects. Like he is trying to, so from the cynical point of view, and many in the Land League saw it like this, it was a form of sort of divide and conquer. What he wanted to do was to make land purchase easier and security of tenure stronger, and give middle-sized farmers essentially the right to buy their own land, to expand the sort of property base in Ireland. But what that did was sort of separate out the middle strata, right? You had this large group of people who didn't have a secure access to land and felt exploited financially. Well, the Land Act essentially draws the top chunk of that into the land-owning class and separates out the bottom chunk that can't afford to buy their own land.
So that's the cynical take.
That's the cynical take. The other take that I think is significant from the 1881 Land Act that Gladstone puts in place is that it is the first time, and progressive liberals get very excited about this, the first time the state intervenes directly in property. Like actually says, no, we are going to step in and we're going to manage, and we say this structure doesn't work. We're going to set down what a fair contract is in terms of property rights. It is not going to be the case that a fair contract when it comes to land is just what the market will bear. It's just what a tenant will agree to and what a landlord will agree to. The government actually, for the first time, says, no, that's an unfair contract. Obviously, this sort of causes conniptions amongst the Conservative Party, who see this as the end of civilization, essentially. And a lot of excitement amongst kind of progressive liberals who would go on to form kind of the sort of early Edwardian kind of progressive movement of state interventionism, because they see it as the first time the state takes a responsibility for the care and welfare of people that aren't women and children, right? It says men for the first time are included in this because it involves everybody. So it's seen as a turning point, and I think in many senses, in terms of what liberal politics can and should do, it is kind of a practical turning point, which is significant. So that's one kind of legacy. The other one is, in terms of the land question in Ireland, that in doing that, in separating that off, in having kind of different segments of the population, now sort of seeking different things, as it were, that it does take the radical sting out of the movement. So, there is still a demand for greater equality in land ownership in Ireland that you can trace right the way through into the early 20th century. But it becomes less of a focus, and the national question, the matter of, independence or home rule becomes predominant. And once you get into, the post-Irish Revolution period, so after the War of Independence and Civil War in 1922, 23, and you get the Irish Free State, they're not so concerned about, land questions or social and economic questions, right? So it seems to die away. And in the US, of course...
obviously, you have World War I as well, and that kind of...
It does change the sort of geopolitical picture. It strengthens the US on a global scale, which changes the nature of a lot of how the arguments can take place, because the British Empire essentially becomes less of a significant force internationally. But I think the trajectory of George's ideas is interesting to me, because a lot of them are kind of subsumed within this idea of a reformist, highly involved liberal state. So it's accepted that land, like other forms of property, should be taxed and managed in some way by the government, by the state. But George's moral position, this idea that this isn't just a question of expediency, but there's moral justice involved in terms of what people are due and their responsibilities and duties in response, or seen in around. That's all gone. So it's interesting. Some of the ideas transition on into what you would call kind of progressive liberalism in the 20th century, but the moral aspect gets lost. And when you're talking about why it is today that we think of a discourse of freedom and individualism as being right-wing, well, that's the other thing that gets tossed away with this moral substructure,
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
That the 1880s and that particular moment around land is when we really get that separation between the two. And you have new liberal, progressive liberal thinkers who will adopt some of George's ideas in terms of taxation of land, turning around and saying, these old liberal ideas of democracy in which, it's too individualistic, right? We need to think of society as an organism that needs managed. Yes, people should participate, but they shouldn't have a say because, we need to manage this technocratically. And also, it gets too kind of messy and dangerous. I mean, they look back at Ireland and they say, people boycotting property, the country in turmoil, the government has no control. This is democracy out of control. This is popular participation out of control. This is what happens when everyone thinks they should have a bit of land and do their own thing, right? You get this messy kind of popular politics that's really dangerous for large accumulations of capital, right? Who knows where it could go next? Who knows what might be taken under by this? And they say, well, actually, and this is T.H. Green, who is probably the most prominent British liberal thinker. He says, and it's essentially the Hobbesian argument you said before, it's the first thing before justice is order. And if we don't have order and we don't have structure to our society and property isn't secure, then we can't have justice for the working class and all these other things that need to happen, right? So you see how the state and capital comes to a kind of accommodation there in that they recognize that they both need protected from this kind of radical democracy. So, I mean, that's me saying this is a kind of a liberal fudge in a sense.
Of course. So let's wind forward to today then. If, as you said, the land question is sort of hardly talked about now. Henry George is...
Yes, yeah.
There's a flame still burning. Maybe it's going to start burning more brightly thanks to conversations like this. But how do you see the world today in terms of, liberalism, land? Is it frustrating? Because you don't strike me as that historian who's sort of obsessed with, 9th century Saxon pottery or whatever. Like there's
a contemporary relevance.
There's a contemporary relevance. There's an actionable substructure to everything you're writing to what's happening today. Have a lot of the fears of radicals and liberals manifested themselves today, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think it's a particularly interesting moment with I go back to the environmental question as being the overarching one essentially here for in terms of my contemporary political interests. We all of our, and this includes George's ideas, but our previous political theories about socialism, liberalism, capitalist ideas are all founded on the notion that we can keep producing and developing and growing, and there's a kind of Promethean sense to all of these ones. That, I mean, this is at the essence of kind of a lot of Marxism, essentially, that we escape, we destroy poverty by bringing everybody up and by escaping the kind of productive confines. Marx wants to get rid of the fetters on industry and grow. To me, the curious thing is that essentially in our new context and environment, all of these things are obsolete. We need to think about new ways of structuring political theory that is not obsessed with or reliant upon the idea of constant economic growth. That's what interests me, and I'm interested from a historical perspective because I can't speak to what contemporary economics or politics necessarily can do today. What I see my role
as that's no bad thing, by the way, because I mean, this is the criticism that was levelled against Henry George, right? That he kind of ignored everything that the neoclassical contemporary economists said. That's all hocus pocus anyway. And he said, I think he even described it as like economics hasn't really developed beyond the level of astrology. And actually, what we need to do is go back to Adam Smith and viewing the economy as this sort of harmonious whole unit rather than breaking it up to kind of different markets and marginal utility.
Absolutely. I mean, this isn't an original thought, but I think there are lots of people working in the realm of political economy, perhaps not your standard economist, but people recognizing that economic thought and political and social thought are not separate things. That they need to be considered together and conceived of together. The risk I often see with this is that you get the value structures from economics being shifted onto social and political and environmental concerns, whereas actually I think it should be the other way around. That we need to think of it in a holistic, in a round, rather than saying, we can apply an economic value to environmental things or to social things, and that will solve our problems. right? It's kind of that's the hollow approach inflicting itself on everything else, whereas actually we need to think of it all conceptually as interlinked and connected. And you're right in saying that someone like George is a person who was doing that, was trying to do that.
Because I think the biggest problem the environmental movement has is trying to make it a science, which is what you've kind of, the economic, ascribing numbers and values and economic theory to it, and also scientific. It's too complex. It's too, you do need, which is why climate science is viewed as, it hasn't won the debate because people don't really believe it, and a lot of it's based on kind of pseudo rationality, sadly. Pseudoscience.
I agree in so much as I think that the basis for developing people's concern and protection of the environment, just like developing people's political participation, has to happen on a grassroots ground level. The most effective campaigns, environmental campaigns, are those that are concerned with what's going on, people's experiences around them, right? You're right, that doesn't have an effect when you tell people numbers and you show them graphs and whatever it is, right? But if you show them that the house is underwater and that their woodland nearby is being knocked down and chopped down or whatever, and that the species, the birds they don't hear anymore, the environment they don't experience anymore is being taken away, is being destroyed, then people are concerned and people are active, and I think that's one thing that I would like to see, is that kind of growing engagement with the natural world as a means towards people feeling empowered to resist that kind of destruction, right? But it's making that work on a kind of, this is ultimately the question that we were stuck with, and the one that George struggled with in his period as well, is that these problems seem immense and massive, and they seem to imply to a lot of people that therefore messy localized democracy doesn't really have a role to play anymore. That the role should be played at state level, top down, like big governments will make decisions.
Climate summits,
which we've seen do very little, and we get into this cycle where it feels like at the root, at the bottom up, people are doing lots of interesting and important things, and at the top people are making rules and regulations that are not being followed, and there's just
a disconnect
and
the rules and regulations are often nonsensical, and I mean, this is where I'm quite sympathetic to that economic growth argument, where you kind of try and, if you make people wealthy enough, they then have the time and the bandwidth to actually think about the environment, whereas when they're poor, it's not on the agenda. And also you create the kind of technological forces that enable you to kind of cope and deal, whether it's cleaner energy, nuclear, whatever it is, or kind of better ways to manage your agriculture is going to be through technology, not through like forcing people to consume less. That's just not going to work politically, but
getting people to consume differently might work. I mean, I think there's several things there. It's interesting that those kind of technological solutions may very well have a very important role to play in terms of protecting the environment and coming up with cleaner solutions. But there is a kind of, when you talked before about the relationship between ideas and kind of technologies and social structures, right? There is a kind of sense in which the things that are going to help us protect the environment in terms of our emotional registers and intellectual approach to the environment are not those things in which the solution is always, more development, more technology, that will solve that problem, will solve that problem. Because what often happens, I think history is just one long lineage of this, is that there's another problem then that needs solved, that is created on top of that. And we're at a point where things seem very critical in terms of how we might get the environment into a position where people could live sustainably and harmoniously with the environment, and constantly feeling like economic growth or development on top of that is going to always be able to come up with the solutions. I don't know. I'm worried about the mental difference. I mean, you mentioned there the curious thing about more wealth and people having more bandwidth to think about these kind of things. and this is like in a way it's sort of analogous to the kind of effective altruism movement, essentially that we're going to solve the world's problems by getting rich enough to be able to spend money and to raise people up out of this certain extreme type of poverty. But what often happens with people in that movement is they get kind of fixated on the numbers, on the detail, and not the wider picture, and the actual ambition and the drive, the intellectual focus on gaining wealth becomes itself a kind of self-directed or self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That becomes the thing that's important. I mean, I think on a local level, you will find generally that the poorer people are, the more engaged they are with the local community, right? That the wealthier people are, the more they tend to be separate from the community. So they might have the bandwidth to engage necessarily, but they might not have the concern because they feel safer, they feel more secure. I think often it's the case that the poorer people are, the more they feel dependent on the community around them. I think that's quite common, and therefore also more dependent on the environment around them. I'm not saying anything of these are kind of universal truths or inevitable truths or anything like this, but I wouldn't necessarily put stock in the idea that as people get richer, they're going to therefore have more social concern or environmental concern.
No, and I feel there is a revival in local behaviour or local. There is a revival in people, particularly in the younger generation, going to church again for whatever that means, whether that's good or bad. And I wouldn't be unsurprised if in the next sort of 20, 30 years there is some sort of land league type movement again.
You've brought it around perfectly here, because I'm really interested. It's really curious to me. We talked about urbanism and transitory life, and we talk about kind of high rents today for people, and meaning that they have to rent until they're however old, and they might never get on the property ladder, or they might have to move all the time. All that mitigates against solid, stable communities where people feel like I need to be engaged in my community. Not just engaged politically, but hey, I might be engaged in this park and helping out here or doing this, or you can't really do that if you think, well, I'm paying extremely high rents and I might have to move because work, because I'm put out of my flat or whatever it is. So having, and this is where these radicals were spot on, having a wider spread of property ownership in terms of some sort of rooted access to a place where you feel secure and part of the community will help politically, and it will help environmentally as well, because people will want to be more engaged.
Democratizing kind of land access.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's, I guess, neatly takes me on to the traditional closing question I ask every guest, which is I call the long bet, which you've got a kind of 10-year time horizon. 2036 to make a prediction of something you'd like to happen and or something you think will happen. And people tend to do something very pessimistic on the thing they think will happen. Not always actually. We've had some optimistic ones, but and so why 10 years? Because it's not so far away that it's meaningless, but it's not so close that it's not. It's not too easy. If that makes sense. So, what's your answer to the long bet?
What will happen in 10 years? I think we will have discovered or have confirmed more fully that we are poisoning our bodies and the environments in ways that we weren't completely cognizant of. I think there will be a mass kind of movement towards resisting that. It will be quite inchoate, but it will be focused on the fact that we are unable to provide healthcare for a wide swathe of our population because of aging and because of growing illness connected to our kind of damaging environment around us. That, I believe, there will be a connection, a growing connection between frustration with healthcare and frustration with the environment. I think those two things are going to merge together because they're so intrinsically connected. So our bodily health and our mental health is connected to the environments that we exist in, our lack of access to nature, but also the degradation of nature together, damaging. I mean, when we talk about mental health crises, we talk about people's screen time, whatever you might think of it, it's undeniable essentially that, we are limiting people's ability to develop and flourish fully mentally and physically, but we're also damaging the environments that they might allow them to do that. At the same time, we are unable to provide kind of comprehensive and equalized healthcare for everybody to deal with these increasing health crises. Those two things, to me, seem like they are going to come together, two large streams into one tidal wave, essentially, and become something that there has to be some form of mass movement against. That's my, I guess, negative and positive together. It's two in one. I think there's going to be, that is going to be the large problem we're going to face, sort of, as a community, as a people, as a global community in the next few years. But I also hope that there will be some kind of bottom-up resistance to that in some form.
A land league of some sort.
Of some form that recognises those interconnections between political disengagement and dispowerment, between environmental degradation and damage to people's health, mental health and physical health, and the possibilities for doing something about that that's not it's not after the fact. It's recognising that you don't just go, oh well, we need more money spent on cancer treatment. Well, actually, we need also to concern ourselves with the environments and improving our environments around us.
I think we're seeing the beginning of that. I mean, if you look at the Make America Healthy Again movement, for example, it's that link between disorders. It is a new type of healthcare problem. Compared to the healthcare systems were set up for a much less aging population. And now we've got all these chronic diseases that are often caused by environmental factors, ultra-processed foods, how we say. I think I couldn't agree with you more that this kind of intrinsic link between your health and the environment will become more manifest. But I think we are seeing a kind of, it might be small, it might be very middle class, who knows, but kind of a return to wanting to understand where your food comes from, wanting fewer ingredients. M&S has just done this new range, which they're expanding, which is just these ingredients,
right? And
it has the front of the bottle. It's just got these 6 things, and these crisps have got potato, salt, and oil, and that's it. Nothing else. There's not like this giant list of additives that are being kind of processed and added to it. And so I think it starts with M&S. Maybe we'll get to Aldi soon, But,
but there's the other side of it. So that is kind of, in a way, it's like a top-down thing. Obviously, you're right. It's influenced by consumer demand.
Choice,
But I'm also thinking about spending more time, children in school going out and growing food and developing a connection with nature, because that's where it's going to come from. They're going to buy those things. They're going to be engaging with them because they know more about food and they know about engagement with the natural world, and they're going to be concerned about preserving things if they associate their childhood with all these natural elements around them that were very special to them, and recognizing their intrinsic connection as human beings, as human animals on the natural world. I just think that's kind of integral to developing what you could call an environmental consciousness.
It's fascinating because the education system, I refer people to the episode I did with Rosina Darelli, who's one of the educational disruptors out there. And there's something called the Alpha School in the US as well, which is doing this as well. But there's a big movement from people trying to remodel the education system away from the it's the factory is the factory model. You have a bell, you clock in, you clock out, you sit, and you're just doing mindless clerical work or kind of factory work all day, kind of rote learning. And there is now a movement away from kind of standardized testing towards project-based work, understanding where things come from, either in a business context or in a kind of process context, and that will all kind of hopefully feed through.
I think there's always maybe this is George's positivity, but there is always room for hope and positivity even in very difficult times, because I think I also share with George that kind of ultimate kind of optimistic kind of approach to human nature. I think we are kind of sociable beings who wish to do good and wish to improve ourselves and wish to improve people around us ultimately, and don't wish to do damage to the natural world,
solutions.
To each other. And I think we will.
I mean, if you look, we often like kind of military history or political history is off basically mostly squabbling, and then every now and then punctuated by people coming together, whether it's the kind of the Greeks coming together to fight off the Persians or whatever, but then the rest of the time they're just kind of hating each other, and hopefully we can do less squabbling. And
that would be nice, yes.
And what's next for you? What are you working on right now?
So, well, So I'm really interested in kind of developing the intersections between environmental and intellectual history, because both of those elements are things I work on, obviously, with the book on the land war. So at the moment, I'm co-authoring a book with the professor at Newcastle, Annie Tindley, on the history of British woodlands. So that's hopefully coming out this year, if I can get it finished.
Yeah.
And the next big project for me is a history of boycotting, which is really a kind of more back to the intersections between popular action and how kind of mass non-violent political protest shaped the views of democracy amongst political thinkers. How did they respond to this? What was essentially a problem for politics, right? People acting together, using their individual freedoms to act collectively, that seemed to threaten the state, and it threatened large concentrations of wealth as well, because if people disengage with them, you actually can't make any wealth. This caused a kind of, an intellectual problem for ideas of democracy. So I'm interested in that. I'm writing a book about that, and then beyond that, I don't know. That's going to take me long enough, I think.
Well, when you're through that, we'll have you on again if
Yes,
you're up for it. I'd love to talk through that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about.
Where can people find you other than at King's College London?
Well, King's College London is a good spot. That's so I've got my staff page up there. Just Googling me will bring things up. I'm not really on Twitter or X anymore very much, but I have a staff page at Newcastle too. So I can, Newcastle and King's, you can find me there.
Yeah, and then we've got Land and Liberalism, Henry George and the Irish Land War.
Yeah.
Hold on one more time. Highly recommend it. Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's been really good.
We'll see you again soon.
Excellent. Thanks.
Cheers. This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Matt Cooper with music composed by Loverman.